author of Raven Rock, who anyone that's been listening to this podcast, you don't even have to be listening from the beginning. Just anyone who's listened to a podcast in the last 10 episodes of any given time that you're listening to this now, you will know Garrett Graff as Garrett Graff, the author of Raven Rock, which everybody needs to listen to. I cite it all the time. I'm obsessed with your book. As you know, I spilled my heart out to you in an email, and stars have aligned. We've got it going, but I'm going to stop blabbering and let you introduce yourself, sir. How are you doing?
I'm well. Thanks so much for your patience in getting this set up, and I'm excited to talk to you.
Of course. So, I've also cited a lot of other books, The Threat Matrix, The Last Plane in the Sky, all great books, but Raven Rock has a special place in my heart, and I can say, hand over my heart, that it is my favorite. There's one fiction book I like. So it is my favorite nonfiction book. I swear over my grandmother, my brother, everyone. It's my favorite nonfiction book. And for everyone listening, it's really quick summary is it's the relocation arc. It's all of the nuclear bunkers that the presidents were going to go to in the event of thermonuclear Armageddon, and how the rest of us were going to die. And I was so shocked by it the first time I heard it, because everything in it sounds like something you'd hear on like an Alex Jones rant. But I was like, this is all research, and I'd pull up citations, and I was like, this is all real. And it's just the whole relocation arc of what it is, from Eisenhower calling JFK or bringing him in Opal 3 to the beginning of the actual rubber casing on the tubing of the plumbing so it doesn't shake around, and you gotta tell me you work for a phone. I'm sorry, I'm blabbering. I have not got starstruck yet, but I'm geeking out right now. So I'll try to take it down a notch.
Well, Tommy, that to me is just what makes this whole world so fascinating. Is like, this is an area where there has been so much science fiction, so much satire. Mm-hmm. I mean, Dr. Strangelove, the preeminent movie of the Cold War. Yeah. And yet at every twist and turn, as I went out and did my research, it turns out that actually the truth of all of these government doomsday plans is even stranger than the fiction and the satire that people came up with along the time. I mean, Dr. Strangelove and all of his worrying about the mine shaft gap.
The mine shaft gap.
Actually, the U.S. government did worry about the mine shaft gap. And they went out and they had Boy Scouts map the nation's abandoned mine shafts in the 1940s and 50s. And you could actually get merit badges as a Boy Scout for helping to find mine shafts that the U.S. government could hide civilians in the event of nuclear war. And just the weirdness of this whole era and the weird sort of, I call it sort of rational irrationality of the planners that sort of pretend as if nuclear war is just one 3-ring binder away from being totally manageable. And the way that you have sort of through this whole era, all of these government agencies that have, what I call sort of their post-apocalyptic analogs. Mm-hmm. The idea that through the Cold War, the U.S. Postal Service was in charge of registering the dead and, figuring out who was left alive in the United States. The idea that the National Park Service was going to be the agency that ran the refugee camps. Because they had the idea that the national parks would be largely untouched by nuclear war, and that you could go out, to Yosemite and thered be this beautiful refugee camp all set up there, run by the National Park Service after California was destroyed. And sort of just, every page of research that I did sort of came up with facts funnier and weirder than anything that a writer could have satirized. up to and including, probably my, one of my 2 or 3 favorite details in the entire book, like the idea that the Federal Reserve built this bunker in Mount Pony, Virginia, that held something like $2 or $3 billion in currency that was going to last the United States the 18 months it would take the Bureau of Engraving and Printing to begin to rebuild our currency reserves.
Yeah.
But that actually much of that money was in $2 bills, because this was the 1970s and the U.S. had relaunched and reissued the Thomas Jefferson $2 bill, and discovered that Americans didn't want to use a $2 bill and just couldn't get people to use it in everyday life. And so rather than pulp it, they packaged up, sealed up all those $2 bills and put them away in the government's doomsday bunker currency reserve, figuring that after nuclear war, people would be less choosy about what kind of currency they were willing to use.
And then it's also, I would, I think it's in World War Z, that zombie movie, really terrible movie, but it begins with you can tell shit's hitting the fan, because they're getting the Declaration of Independence, they're getting the Liberty Bell, you see them, we're bringing it into the bunker, and it's, when I first saw that, I was like, that's stupid. But then you go into it and they had a whole list, and not only that, really, they had a list thought out and thought through. This had priority over that, had priority over that, had priority over that, and that was going to be saved and this wasn't. And it was it really was the plan to save the government while everyone else died. It was
and there's sort of a there's an arc to this as the presidency changes, as technology changes, as the military changes, because in the 1940s and 50s, really, time and space existed in such a way that you didn't need you couldn't have this system on hair trigger alert. And you're talking about atomic bombs delivered by bombers. You're talking about something that's going to be 6, 8, 10, 12 hours notice. You're talking about a scenario where you're looking at a few dozen or a few score atomic bombs. And so there's sort of this moment and this change, over the course of the beginning of the Cold War, where people actually sort of imagine a scenario where you could have a survivable nuclear war. And America goes through this era of the 1950s with these massive national civil defense drills, Operation Alerts, these sort of full-scale, full-city alerts that are unimaginable to us today. The idea that all of New York City would shelter in place. The New York Stock Exchange would shut down. The buses would stop in the middle of the road and let people run down into fallout shelters. And then, you go from bombers to missiles, you go from atomic bombs to thermonuclear bombs, and you go from tens, scores to hundreds, then thousands, and ultimately tens of thousands of nuclear weapons. To the point where nuclear war is, all but instantaneous, and it is unsurvivable. And so you sort of see these grand, ambitious plans at the start of the start of nuclear war, the start of the Cold War, where they sort of really do think about all of the nation being able to survive, and sort of it gradually shrinks and shrinks and shrinks until you get to the plans as they existed in the 1980s, as they exist today, which is basically talking about, saving 1,000 Americans, and leaving the rest to survive on their own.
And and that's the exact evolution of it. I'm trying to think of an analogy. It almost, You could say early on it was almost like a plane that lost an engine. It was like, all right, like, 45 seconds till impact. Like, all right, put your head down. It really almost is duck and cover, right? It's put your head down, impact, impact, impact. And as it progressed to hypersonic missiles coming in from orbit with multi-megaton bombs, it then turned into more of a car crash where it's you're driving. When it happens to the time it's finished, you haven't even realized it started yet. And it's like, you got to have airbags and you got to have seatbelts. But unless you're in that car, everyone outside, pedestrians, dude, there's no like clear the landing area. It's like honk honk, like you're dead, right? And that's what always kind of chilled me the most was like Eisenhower realizing just what it was, right? The tactician, the logistics master, just like telling people like, there's so many great quotes or like loose quotes. He's like, you don't understand. He was like, men will be nuts. People will be going crazy. This is going to happen in 1600 seconds, and we are going to go from today to bows and arrows in a matter of hours. He was like, man will be mad. Nothing will work out. And it's I think that might have actually been the turning point. I think you mentioned it. It was one of the Soviet leaders. He was like, when I came into power, I couldn't sleep for days because I knew these weapons existed. And then I realized we couldn't ever use these. And I started sleeping like a baby, right? And so there's a couple of the craziest things that's in your book that I still like research independently. And I'll go with the first one is, so on that mindset of going from plane crash to car crash to, right, these bigger and bigger bombs, faster and faster, you got to really hit the deck like that, right? There's no everybody get to shelter. It's like, Mr. President, get down. Everyone else is dead.
Yep.
You mentioned JFK talking to that journalist. What do you mean? We have a hustling, bustling Soviet enclave 3 blocks from the White House. And JFK pauses, fork halfway between plate and mouth, and says, they have an atomic bomb in the Russian embassy. Sure, why not? No, they do. They smuggled in the pieces in diplomatic pouches. Like, okay. He's like, do you know something I don't know? But what do you think about that? Because that does seem to be the decapitation move, is instantaneous. Do you think there's any way that it's evolved around that today?
It's a really good question, and you see this go through sort of a couple of different eras, right? So there is this fear that the Soviet embassy, 3 blocks north of the White House on 16th Street in D.C. is potentially something that could have a small nuclear device in its attic. Mm-hmm. That rumor was widely believed during the Cold War. It has never been conclusively proven. Mm-hmm. And it may never be. And that may not mean that it didn't exist, but it at least didn't exist. It hasn't been anything that U.S. intelligence has ever confirmed. And then after the Cold War, you sort of see the continuity plans react to a couple of events in the 1990s. The main one being this Japanese doomsday cult releases basically homemade sarin gas in the Tokyo subway and kills an enormous number of people, although they sort of just slightly messed it up and so didn't kill tens of thousands of people. But that leads to the U.S. government really trying to think through basically like what happens if Washington is attacked on any given day. Mm-hmm. And, how do you have this city where on a normal basis, the president, the vice president, other top officials are working in very close proximity. And you may not actually have time or ability or redundancy such that one of the top officials survives. Yeah. And so they begin to really try to build out the idea of basically a permanent reserve people operating these facilities 24 hours a day that most people had sort of given up at the end of the Cold War. And then 9/11 happens, and this becomes sort of very obvious and very important to U.S. continuity planning, and is the type of thing that you see this is where Dick Cheney sort of disappears off the radar in the fall of 2001, heading off to undisclosed locations, which turn out, years later, we realize are sort of far less dramatic than we might have realized, because he's actually like off at fishing camps and hunting camps, just in rural places where he's able to be low key, low profile enough that he's sort of secure because people just don't know he's there. But it becomes this sort of joke through the fall of 2001, and that's really due to the need to have someone able to survive one of the worst things that could happen.
Yeah. Let's segue that, because I was thinking, like, I actually didn't know the answer, and I realized, like, we are kind of in a peculiar spot. So for all future listeners, it's 4:18 p.m. It is November 10th, 2020. Right now, the 45th president is Donald J. Trump, and the president-elect is Joseph R. Biden Jr. I was thinking, how does all of this shift as we're in this, like, 2-month gap between, do they start moving some people in? Do they have their reserve government? Do they start getting priority because it's like now he's the next in line? Do they start getting the proverbial not red phone, but the helicopter landing on the rooftop and grab them? You got to have the gold thing, and if you don't, get off. How does that play out? Do you know that?
Yeah.
I don't.
So there's sort of a couple of things that take place right now. Part of what I think we're sort of all learning right now is this sort of schoolhouse rock education in how our elections actually unfold.
Yeah.
So the media at this point, as you said, has projected that Joe Biden has won the presidency based on the informal, unofficial counts from secretaries of state.
Sure.
There are sort of two legal moments when Joe Biden becomes the president-elect. Neither of which has happened yet. Yeah. As you said, at 4:21 on Tuesday afternoon.
Yeah.
The first is the head of the GSA, which is basically the U.S. government's real estate agency, makes a legal determination that Joe Biden is the president-elect. Okay. And it's called an ascertainment. And it is just a letter saying, "Dear Joe, looks to me like you're the president-elect."
Sure.
And what that means is that's what officially unlocks what is still candidate Biden's access to the U.S. government.
Okay.
And so there are sort of a couple of things that triggers. One is access to federal transition dollars to pay for a transition staff. It's government email addresses, it's government cell phones, it's government office space.
The good stuff.
And then that sort of, triggers some other parts of that where, those transition documents become official government documents, that have to be retained by the National Archives, yada, yada, yada. It also unlocks the ability of the candidate to receive, the candidate and his staff really, to begin to receive classified information. And Joe Biden has already been given a couple of sort of courtesy briefings by the team that does the so-called President's Daily Brief, the PDB, that daily intelligence briefing. But that document from the GSA then sort of allows him to get more routine briefings and begin to distribute those briefings to staff that he so designates and sort of things like that.
Okay.
As part of all of that, you also begin to see the Secret Service makes its own determinations, and they have already begun to move a larger detail up to Wilmington, Delaware, to help secure the still technically candidate Joe Biden, with the assumption that he will be the president-elect.
Sure.
That trigger, sort of the Secret Service ultimately, works with the FAA to establish national defense airspace over Joe Biden's house in Delaware. And so, in theory, there would now be combat air patrols from the Air Force or other law enforcement, being able to intercept the president, intercept planes. And I don't know if you can actually hear
those
there's a fighter passing over my head.
I was about to say,
now.
that's
that
a little weird.
A combat air patrol over my house.
That's a little wave to the NSA boys. That's crazy.
And then the second aspect of this is the Electoral College will meet on December 14th. And their votes to elect a president and a vice president is what begins the formal process that of sort of the clock ticking down to January 20th at noon, when the Constitution says power shifts.
Yeah.
And so what that means is that formally establishes Joe Biden as the president-elect, and it establishes Kamala Harris as the vice president-elect.
Okay.
And that matters because should something happen to Joe Biden between December 14th and January 20th, then Kamala Harris would be sworn in automatically on January 20th as the surviving vice president-elect.
Okay.
We not to get sort of too out there and sort of science fiction-y wise right now, but like there is a very real and open and unsettled legal question of sort of what happens to the president-elect if he or someday she dies between election day and the day of the Electoral College. So that becomes a very messy, very bad legal situation very quickly.
That gets hairy quick. Yeah. I was gonna say, I don't know why I'm trying to give you advice. You're the best-selling author, but man, that would be a cool book. If you did I don't know, like what it'd be, name it, I don't know, 79 days or something. You'd be like, how does the life change? You could go from just, again, I don't know why I'm giving you advice, but how you laid out Raven Rock, man, you would just have it start from like cell phones changing to fiber optics coming in to more guys around the house to all of a sudden now there are no planes overhead and it's starting on this day. That would be really cool how the whole apparatus changes. And then you'd slowly be, and then and now whenever this happens, you go to this bunker and you go to this bunker.
Yep.
That would be a really cool book. Again, I don't know why I'm trying to give you advice. You're the author. Yes, that's insane. Thank you for answering that question. The two other ones is the one that always stuck out in my mind, because as much as I love nonfiction, my mind always drifts into the absurd and the magnificent and the awesome. The DUCC, the Deep Underground Command Center. When I first heard that, I almost stopped listening to the book because I was like, all right, this guy's just peddling like horseshit. I was like, that's not real. I was like, I would know about, in all of my ego, I was like, I would know about that. The Deep Underground Command Center indeed was proposed to be 3,000 to 4,000 feet below the Pentagon, with a high-speed elevator. And again, I thought you didn't. I was like, there's no way you got this right. To survive 200 to 300 megaton warheads. I was like, the biggest, in like the next chapter, it's like, and remember, the biggest bomb ever was 50 megatons. And I was like, oh my God. I mean, like a crazy person on a sidewalk, like the end is near, or like, you know, spread the good word. I was like, did you guys know about the Deep Underground Command Center? Like, you know, like a real sane person. But that's what I've kind of bringing it back to that A-bomb in the Soviet embassy. I've always thought like that would be just with that paranoid Cold War planning. I feel like that's the ultimate end game, is you would have something directly beneath your feet and you could just go straight down. Do you think that was ever fleshed out more, or did you think it really did die in the drawing board?
So the challenge of the duck,
yeah.
UCC.
Yeah.
So this was sort of roughly the Kennedy era.
Yeah.
And the challenge that they basically ended up facing, which it remains sort of effectively insurmountable, is yes, you can dig a deeper hole, and you can eventually get to a point that is so deep that it is untouchable by you know, even the largest nuclear weapons. But what you're basically digging is a tomb.
Yeah.
And that if once you sort of dig something so deep that it could withstand the largest nuclear attacks, any nuclear attack anywhere close to that would destroy thoroughly, you know, all of the communications apparatus, all of the, you know, entry and egress tunnels that you could possibly dig, and would basically just create such a mound of rubble over top of the command center that it would be pointless, that there would be sort of nothing. The people inside would live, but sort of to what end? There would be nothing that, you know, they wouldn't be able to speak to anyone. They wouldn't be able to get in or out, and no one would know that they were there. And so sort of it becomes this like, you know, tautological, philosophical, like what happens if you have a government and no one knows it's there?
Yeah, does it?
And the answer was no one was ever able to solve that. And you know, I'm not sure, frankly, that like anyone even today with, you know, decades of advancing technology and a lot more money and you know, even today's most secret high classified programs has a better solution, because you know, you just sort of run up against this sort of basic problem of physics, where you know, sort of all of the facets can't come together in a survivable way.
Yeah, you're right. And I think you mentioned it in your book. It wasn't LeMay. It was like one of LeMay's right hand men, who is like, without my phone, I rule over my desk, which isn't very effective. He's like, the whole thing is communication. There's no point to, we survived, but to what end? You know, if it's there, no one knows it's there. Is it there? I don't know. Maybe you'd put in like your B team, and it'd be like, you know, you are there on the off chance I die, like you're the president. And I don't know. Maybe someone would take that stand or take that role. You're right that there is just kind of like a certain physics that you can't get away from with that. I just lost my train of thought. Whatever. The other thing is Air Force One on 9/11, the RATO or JATO, the rocket assisted takeoff. I'd always, again, because I'm a normal person and think about these things, I'd always wondered, I'm like, if there was a 747 that could do something insane, it would be Air Force One. And in your book, you cited several direct witnesses who said, you know, from the ground, police officers saying, I've never seen a 747 take off like nose over tail and rocket into the clouds. People on the plane were saying, like, why am I sitting like a space shuttle? And like, you know, someone on there, like a staffer, saying there are two planes in the world that can do this, and they're both Air Force One. And it's obviously highly classified. Did you ever find out anything more about that, or is this just a weird thing that I'm oddly interested in? But to me, that is the most insane thing ever.
You are correct to be quite fascinated by it. And I do know more about it than went into the book. And I will leave it at that.
Oh, how dare you! Oh, it's brutal. A true entertainer. My God. You know what? Garrett Graff, no longer my favorite author, guys. His podcast is over. Yeah.
It is there is a special mechanism that you allude to there that I allude to in the book, and it has only been used once, and it was on 9/11 to take off from Sarasota, Florida.
Yeah.
And we don't know. It has never been otherwise discussed publicly, and it. And sort of one of the interesting questions is, we are right in the midst of an upgrade to a new Air Force One style plane right now. And it'll be sort of curious to know what sort of new security measures end up going into that plane.
Which I cannot believe they're changing the livery.
And my hope is, I actually was thinking about
unforgivable.
this the other day. I'm hoping that Joe Biden acts quickly to keep the livery the same.
That is unforgivable. As everyone on this podcast knows, I am more conservative, but that is something that I cannot forgive any president. To take away that baby blue, to me, that's treason. I think you should be shot. That's terrible. You cannot do that. They're turning it into a cheap airline. I saw that and I was like, okay, you know what? COVID's one thing, human rights are another. I'm like, if you take that livery off that goddamn plane, that is the most but that is a rant for another podcast. So one thing I thought about way back, this is episode 244, way back in like episode 40, I was talking to a friend in the Air Force about Raven Rock, and he brought up a question that I never thought of, and it was and you kind of touched on it though with the duck, the DUCC, is obviously, I mean, they had all these double features, right? Walk-in freezers that also acted as morgues. And they had, like, armories. They had allegedly straitjackets, right? They had alcohol to wean off senators, right? They had birth control. So, in case D.C. just acted like D.C., they wouldn't have a population overrun. The question my friend brought up was, at some point, if they do emerge from their bunker, how do they rule over what is left? Do they have soldiers? Do they have weaponry? Because if you come out and it's just this Mad Max world of irradiated people, and you come out and you're like, I know that you guys haven't had written language in 2 generations. We are the leaders. And they're just like, they have nice skin, kill them. Something like some barbaric stuff like that. Did you ever touch in on that, or is that just a weird thought? But like, what if you can't? How do you rule, right? How do you rule?
Yeah, so there's sort of 2 things that are important to sort of talk about in this, and it's a really big, important question. So the first is, even among the worst case scenarios of the Cold War, all-out thermonuclear war, you end up with an America that has about 60 million people left, which is a country sort of, roughly equivalent to France.
Yeah.
So, like, not small. Obviously, physically scattered around the country. But that's still a pretty big country, and would sort of require, a real government to try to function. And a lot of people, I think, when they sort of start thinking about this, like, they think that the people in the bunker are going to be like the ones, remating and regrowing the human race in the bunkers to come back above ground. And Dr.
Dr.
Strangelove satirizes some of that.
Yeah.
But that's really just not the reality of of sort of even the worst case scenarios of the Cold War. And obviously, like, that's still a really bad scenario. I mean, you're talking about 200 million people dying.
An acceptable number of deaths.
Right. But you were talking about sort of the United States not being wiped off the face of the earth, but from going from a large country to a medium-sized country. And so that's where you have the need for the government to survive. And then sort of part of this answer, and this is one of the things that I just find sort of most fascinating about this whole world, and I always talk about this, and I always sort of cite this when I'm talking about history, is the way that the planners during the Cold War sort of thought about this at a philosophical and spiritual level, which is, one of the parts of the question that you were asking is, if America is going to survive, if you're going to save America, what is America? Is it the president? Is it the three branches of government? Is it Congress? Is it, a certain set of, state leaders and federal leaders and local leaders? And their answer was sort of like, yes to all of the above, sort of. But the real answer is America is just an idea. We don't have a royal family, a sort of single bloodline that you are supposed to be able to follow down century to century, like the Windsor family in the UK. We don't have, crowns or royal scepters or bejeweled thrones or anything like that sort of show you show you who your sovereign is. What we have are sort of these totems of history that have been handed down to us generation by generation. And we have this idea of sort of a country that is not founded on any single race, religion, ethnicity, any sort of ancestral homeland of a people. And so what the planners sort of answered the question that you're asking obliquely in the Cold War was that we had to save these totems. And so they came up with these plans to save and evacuate the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and the Lincoln's Gettysburg Address and George Washington's Military Commission. If sort of one of my top two favorite facts is the $2 bill story. The other one that's sort of my favorite fact from this whole book project is the idea that there was like a specially trained team of park rangers in Philadelphia during the Cold War whose job it was to evacuate the Liberty Bell. And that sort of, I have this sort of picture in the sort of Christopher Guest movie version of the apocalypse of like these park rangers like driving off into the Appalachian Mountains with the Liberty Bell swinging in the back of a pickup truck and like getting to their evacuation facility and being like, no, we swear the crack was there before we left Philadelphia. And sort of their idea was, that it's those totems that after war will show America that this is still America. And I sort of think of it in the context of, the Independence Day movie where you have Bill Pullman standing in the back of that pickup truck, sort of rallying people in the desert. Tomorrow will be the Independence Day for the world. And like, what their question was what does Bill Pullman need to hold up in that moment in the back of the pickup truck in the middle of nowhere to say, I'm the president, we still are a country, we are still a people. And so their answer was, the Constitution and the Declaration of Independence and the Liberty Bell. And to me, it was just sort of this incredible moment of sort of coming to understand what America really is. And what it is it's these institutions, it's these sort of practices and norms and traditions of democracy that we inherit from previous generations and we hand down to the next generation, that our ancestors sort of fought and guarded and built a rule of law. And that our job is that we inherit the rule of law and we care for it and we tend it and then we hand it off to our children. And there is no rule of law. There's no gavel that I can hand you that says see, this is still the rule of law. It's this idea that if you are told to do something that that means something. And that we sort of all have to buy into these institutions and we all have to care for them. And then we sort of have to hand them off to the next generation as undamaged as we can. And so in some ways, the question that you ask of how do you emerge from the bunker and tell people that you are the ruler again is the fundamental question of American history. And it is in some ways answered in this deeply profound and moving way by these planners who realize saving America isn't about a person or a people or a group of people. It's about how do you save the idea of America.
I got goosebumps when you were describing that, because I never thought about it as I started this conversation, I was silly things like these, these totems. But as you're saying that, it's well, you're right. There can't Oval Office. That's going to be vaporized, right? There's no lapel that you hand over or that pin that you hand over, and it is you do need these things. It's an item to rally behind, right? It's the cross appearing in the sky above the Battle of Lepanto. It's what is our thing? What is our sword or our spear that pierced Christ's side, right? It's these physical things. And it's I just imagine in an irradiated earth, everyone dead, 2 miles underground somewhere, there's a couple people, and then there's just this helium filled bulletproof glass of the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence, and there's just the Liberty Bell, and on top of the crack, now half of it is just black because the thermal pulse hit it right before the doors closed, right? And it's there's some toke, right? Maybe there's some cesium on the side of it or something, and it's those actually do have a lot of value. And I had never thought about that till you said that. I thought it was silly, but now I'm oh, that's beautiful. I've only got you for 2 more minutes, and obviously I could talk to you for 100 hours, but I'll be respectful of your time. I don't know, man. I got goosebumps thinking about that. I was that is the most beautiful thing. And you're right. And it's even now, and that's one thing I keep trying to point to in this year, is 2020. Everyone's it's done. America's over. I keep thinking okay, well, first of all, the beginning of America, we were supposed to be over before we started. All right. And then we were supposed to be over in World War II or after Pearl Harbor. And then the Cuban Missile Crisis. And then a year later, they iced the president in Dallas. And then, or they being whoever, it doesn't matter, the president was killed. And then we still got through the rest of the Cold War. Then we got through 9/11. And then we got through the 2008 crisis, right? And then, by God, we elected a black president. And everything it kept going, right? And then Donald Trump, by God, as president. And now it's COVID, riots, what's going on? Is China encroaching on us? The climate's going up, and are we running out of fossil fuel? And it's just this whole morphing thing. But at the very core, there's just this thing that will keep going forward, right? And it doesn't, everything around it, the outer peripheries of the onion might get obliterated and ablated, but there's just this thing that like inches forward, and it's like just the notch of the president. It's just think another hole, 46, and it just, and you don't know everything around it. Could, I mean, the Twin Towers can come down, the Pentagon can get hit with a plane, but it's still just like, it's like that clock that Bezos bought and put it in a cave somewhere. It's like this crystal clock that's supposed to run for 10,000 years, and it's like everything else may die, but this thing is just, and I love your book, man. I'm at 45 minutes on the nose. I love your book. To everyone, I recommend a lot of books on this podcast. I have on a lot of authors. If there is one book, My God in Heaven, Raven Rock by Garrett M. Graff, I will put it in the description. I will put it in the top comment. I'm going to make the thumbnail, the photo of the book. Listen to it, because it doesn't matter what you believe in. It's the most chilling. It's crazier than any sci-fi. It is and I touched on a couple of my favorite questions. There are 1,000 more that any of you listening will. I mean, it will change the way you look at everything. It really did for me, and now I'm just fanboying. So, Mr. Graff, thank you so much. I'm the biggest fan of yours. I have to ask you before you go, what's in the works?
So I'm actually working on a new book that I hope will come out next year or the year after. That is a history of Watergate, sort of a soup to nuts, start to finish narrative of Watergate, which has been a tremendously fun project to work on, in part because it is also a much crazier and weirder story than any of us remember, and there's a lot more to it than 5 burglars and a resignation. So it's been a fun project to work on, and there's a lot of new history actually out there to be told about it.
If there's anyone that could tell the story, it's you. Again, at this point, I'm just kissing your ass. You were I love your work, man. And this is, my podcast is yours. You have a running appointment. You tell me when you come on, it's yours. It's very small right now, but God willing, this becomes a huge podcast one day. You have a running appointment with me. You tell me, I will boot off whoever is in line. Sorry, Grandma, get out of here. Graff's coming up. I love your work, man. I'm gonna stop just praising you now. It's getting weird. Take care. God bless.
Well,
God
bless
America.
For having me.
Thank you, man. Thank you so much. Take care. God bless America. Everybody, stay safe. Love each other. Peace, Garrett.
Have a great day.
You too, buddy.